The girl stood in the doorway like a ghost made flesh, her small hands gripping a carpetbag that had seen better decades. At 17, Clara May possessed the kind of beauty that made men forget their prayers, golden hair that caught lamplight like spun wheat, eyes blue as mountain lakes, and skin that had never known hard labor. But it was her silence that unnerved Thomas most. She hadn't spoken a single word since her father counted the bills and walked away without looking back. Thomas Brennan wiped his palms on worn denim, suddenly aware of every creak in his weathered cabin, every shadow dancing on pine walls. At 34, he'd grown comfortable with solitude on his remote Montana ranch. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles south, and winters stretched long enough to make a man forget the sound of his own voice. He'd sent for a wife through the matrimonial papers, expecting someone older, someone who understood the harsh realities of frontier life. Not this child who trembled like a deer sensing wolves. "You hungry?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. Clara's eyes darted toward him, then away, focusing on the stone fireplace where embers glowed like tiny hearts. She shook her head once, barely perceptible. The arrangement papers crinkled in Thomas's shirt pocket, a legal marriage contract signed by her father in exchange for enough money to save their failing farm. Everything above board, everything proper by territorial law. But looking at her now, seeing how her wedding dress hung loose on her slight frame, Thomas felt something twist in his gut that had nothing to do with righteousness. He'd built this cabin with dreams of filling it with laughter, children's voices, the warmth of shared purpose. Instead, silence stretched between them like a chasm. Clara moved to the window, pressing pale fingers against cold glass, staring out at endless wilderness that must have seemed like the edge of the world. "The spare room's yours," Thomas said finally. "Lock works from the inside." For the first time she looked directly at him. Something flickered in those blue depths. Surprise, maybe relief. She nodded once, clutching her bag tighter. Outside, wind howled through pine branches, and snow began to fall in fat, lazy flakes. Winter was coming early this year, and they were about to be trapped together in ways neither had imagined when those papers were signed. 3 days passed in careful choreography. Thomas rose before dawn, tended cattle in the bitter cold, and returned to find Clara moving through his kitchen like a whisper. She cooked simple meals that tasted better than anything he'd managed alone, and cleaned with methodical precision. But she never spoke, never met his eyes for more than a heartbeat. On the 4th morning, Thomas found her standing barefoot in the kitchen, staring at frost patterns on the window. Her nightgown was thin cotton, inadequate for Montana cold, and her lips had taken on a blue tinge. "Jesus, girl, you'll catch your death." He grabbed a wool blanket from the couch, wrapping it around her shoulders. She flinched at the contact, but didn't pull away. "Clara," he waited until she looked at him. "This ain't right. None of this is right." Her eyes widened, fear flickering like candlelight. Did she think he meant to send her back? Return her like damaged goods to a father who'd already spent the money? "I know what that paper says," Thomas continued, his voice gentle, "but you're still a child, and I ain't the kind of man who—" He stopped, running weathered hands through graying hair. "What I'm saying is, nothing has to happen here that you don't want. Nothing." Clara's fingers found the blanket's edge, worrying the wool. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Papa said you'd expect certain things, said it was my duty now." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He thought of her father, a thin, desperate man with gambling debts and empty eyes, and felt rage burn in his chest. "Your papa was wrong about a lot of things, I reckon." Thomas kept his distance, letting his words carry the weight. "You're safe here. That's all that matters." Something shifted in her expression, a wall cracking, letting light through. She pulled the blanket closer and nodded, tears threatening to spill. But even as relief flooded through him, Thomas heard something that made his blood freeze. Hoofbeats approaching fast, multiple riders cutting through morning stillness. Through the kitchen window, he counted 4 men on horseback, their faces hard as winter stone. The lead rider dismounted, boots hitting frozen ground with authority. Thomas recognized the silver badge gleaming on his coat, territorial marshal. Behind him rode 3 men, Thomas knew by reputation, Clara's uncle and 2 hired guns with dead eyes and quick hands. They'd come for her. Marshal Garrett's knock rattled the cabin door like thunder. Thomas moved slowly, deliberately, his hand brushing the rifle mounted above the fireplace. Clara pressed herself against the kitchen wall, the blanket clutched around her like armor. "Open up, Brennan. Official business." Thomas lifted the door latch, stepping onto the porch with calculated calm. 4 men faced him, Garrett's weathered features neutral, professional. Clara's uncle, William Hayes, stood behind the marshal's left shoulder, his narrow face twisted with something that might have been righteousness or greed. The 2 hired guns flanked them, hands resting near their holsters with practiced ease. Marshal Thomas nodded, "Kind of early for social calls." "This ain't social." Garrett's voice carried the weight of territorial authority. "Got a complaint filed yesterday. Says you're harboring a minor against her family's wishes." "That's so." Thomas kept his tone level, aware of how quickly things could turn bloody. "Might want to check your paperwork. Girl's my lawful wife, married proper with her father's blessing." William Hayes stepped forward, spitting tobacco juice into the snow. "That marriage ain't legal. Girl was coerced, threatened. We got witnesses say you forced her into it." Thomas felt ice form in his veins. He'd expected this, the sudden change of heart now that the money was spent and Clara was gone. Probably figured they could get her back and find another buyer, maybe one willing to pay more. "Witnesses," Thomas repeated. "That include the same father who signed the papers and took my money. Money that was stolen property." Hayes shot back. "We got proof that payment came from cattle rustling. Makes the whole transaction illegal." The lie hung in the frigid air like smoke. Thomas saw the trap now. They'd fabricate charges, drag him to territorial court, and take Clara while he rotted in jail awaiting trial. By the time his name was cleared, she'd have disappeared into arrangements far worse than the one her father had made. Behind him, Thomas heard the soft creak of floorboards. Clara appeared in the doorway, still wrapped in the wool blanket, her face pale but determined. "Uncle William," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I wondered when you'd come." Garrett shifted in his saddle, studying the girl with professional interest. "Miss Hayes, you need to come with us. There's been allegations made about your situation here." Clara's blue eyes found Thomas's, holding his gaze for a long moment. In that look he saw a decision being made, one that would determine whether either of them survived the next few minutes. The wind picked up, sending snow swirling between the cabin and the mounted men, and Thomas realized they were balanced on the edge of violence with nowhere left to retreat. "I ain't going anywhere." Clara's words cut through the morning air with quiet force. She stepped fully onto the porch, bare feet against cold wood, positioning herself beside Thomas with deliberate courage. Marshal Garrett frowned, his professional composure flickering. "Miss, you don't understand the situation. These men are here for your protection." "Protection?" Clara's laugh held no humor. "Marshal, did Uncle William tell you what he wanted to protect me from when Papa first talked about this arrangement?" William's face darkened. "Girl's been poisoned against her family. Don't listen to her lies." But Clara continued, her voice growing stronger. "He told Papa I was too pretty to waste on some poor cowboy. Said he knew men in Denver who'd pay 3 times as much for a girl like me.
Oh.
Men who wouldn't bother with marriage papers." The words hit like physical blows. Thomas saw Garrett's expression shift, his lawman's instincts recognizing truth when he heard it. The hired guns exchanged glances, suddenly less certain about their employer's righteousness. "That's a serious accusation," Garrett said slowly. Clara reached into the pocket of her nightgown, producing a folded letter. Her hands shook only slightly as she offered it to the marshal. "Uncle William wrote to Papa about his plans. Papa kept the letter because he couldn't read it himself. Asked me to read it to him later." Thomas watched Garrett unfold the paper, saw his face harden as he scanned the contents. Whatever was written there painted William Hayes in colors darker than mountain shadows. "This letter," Garrett's voice carried new weight. "This describes arrangements that would be highly illegal in this territory. William lunged forward, desperate. She wrote that herself. Girls lying to save her own skin. In your handwriting. Garrett's tone had turned ice cold, with details about specific establishments in Denver that we've been investigating for months. The trap was closing, but around the wrong man. Clara had been holding evidence of her uncle's real intentions, proof that her father's arrangement with Thomas, whatever its flaws, had saved her from something infinitely worse. Thomas felt a strange warmth bloom in his chest as he looked at the girl beside him. She'd been protecting them both, waiting for the right moment to reveal what she knew. The silence he'd mistaken for fear had been strength, patience, the quiet courage of someone who'd learned to survive by watching and waiting. Clara's fingers found his arm, a gentle touch that spoke volumes. Thomas has been kind to me, Marshall, kinder than any man in my family ever was. Snow continued falling around them, but the cold seemed less bitter now. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not as strangers bound by papers, but as allies who'd chosen to stand side by side against the darkness that had pursued her across two territories. Marshal Garrett folded the letter carefully, his decision crystallizing in the mountain air.
Oh,
William Hayes, you're under arrest for conspiracy to engage in human trafficking. Boys, he addressed the hired guns, I'd recommend you ride out while you still can. The two gunmen needed no further encouragement. They mounted quickly and spurred their horses toward the valley, leaving William to face justice alone. His protests echoed across the snow-covered clearing as Garrett secured iron shackles around his wrists. This ain't over, Clara, William snarled as he was forced onto his horse. Your papa will hear about this betrayal. Papa's dead, Uncle William. Clara's voice carried quiet finality. Died 3 days after you left with Thomas's money. Drank himself to death on guilt and whiskey. The words struck like thunder. Thomas felt the last piece of Clara's puzzle fall into place. She was truly alone now, with nowhere to return, and no family left to claim her. As the marshal's party disappeared into the tree line, silence settled over the cabin like a benediction. Thomas and Clara stood on the porch, watching until the last hoofbeat faded into winter stillness. Why didn't you tell me? Thomas asked gently. About your father, about the letter.
oh,
Clara turned to face him, and for the first time he saw not a frightened child, but a young woman who'd survived more than anyone her age should endure. Because I needed to know what kind of man you were, whether you'd protect me or use me like the others wanted to. And now? A smile touched her lips, the first real smile he'd seen. Now I know. They went inside together, and Clara began preparing coffee with sure, steady hands. The cabin felt different somehow, warmer, more alive. They were still strangers in many ways, still had years of careful trust building ahead of them, but they had time now, and choice, and the beginning of something that might someday become real affection. Years later, when Clara was 25, and their own daughter played in the same kitchen where she'd once stood silent and afraid, she would tell Thomas that she'd fallen in love not with the man who'd bought her, but with the one who'd set her free. Outside their window, snow continued to fall on the Montana wilderness, blanketing the world in pristine white, clean, beautiful, and full of infinite possibility.